Welcome back. I hope you all had an amazing workshop session. I'm waiting for Chris Wilty to join our group. I had a fantastic conversation. It was so great we love this awesome platform that we were able to do this. This is one of the reasons why we chose Excellements, is because it had the capacity for us to break out into small groups and like have real discussions like we're in person, but we're not. Hey Chris, how did your conversation go?
It was great. We had some people who work in government, we had some advocates, we had some people who kind of straddle both lines, and then I was in there just trying to complicate things. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. What about
Yeah,
you?
I'm like, oh, I had an amazing conversation. We had a really small group, but we had people that were, yeah, on the back end side as like planners and city official, and then we also had a great group of, and then we also had an advocate, like I think one of the strongest and long-term advocates in our state. So we had a really excellent conversation. Feel free to drop in the chat, everyone, your main topics of conversation, and Chris and I are going to talk about what we learned in ours. We'd love to hear what you guys learned. One of like some of the big takeaways that we had, and I think Chris, you and I talked about this a lot, is that advocacy and planning and making these changes towards building a more bicycle friendly state, active transportation friendly state, it's a long game. Like you can't expect to like come in and change things right away. It's going to take a long time in order to make things happen, sometimes like 20 plus years from the planning to the implementation.
Yeah, one of the main kind of the synopsis that one of our members came up with that I thought was really good was this idea that you need to have a sort of clear and concise message to relay to the right people. And sometimes we don't get either of those right. So sometimes we're asking for the wrong things because maybe we don't understand certain things, or we don't know what we don't know. And also we're maybe targeting the wrong people for our angst or for
That's
our
like a
communication.
That's a really good comment, because sometimes it can be really tricky to figure out who that right person is, but it's a matter of just talking, communicating, and I think showing up regularly. And with a lot of the community meetings going virtual, it has made it more accessible. In some cases, it's made it less accessible, but I think, yeah, building those relationships so you know exactly who to talk to in order to make things happen is really key. It looks like Margaret from advocacy group H shared some stuff about what they talked about. Talked about communications between townships and communities and how things can begin with getting folks on bikes and then can be priced out with bikes over 1K, and talked about the importance of giving kids bikes and how even though we want biking to be more inclusive, depending on the daytime race, you could be treated differently and put in an unsafe space. Wow, you guys had a very in-depth conversation. That is really cool. Yeah, and I believe, Meg, is this Meg from Augie Bikes up north? Thank you for sharing that. Chris, you want to read what Lulu talked about in her group?
Yeah, Lulu said our group discussion was awesome. We were able to discuss HB 142 and the new stop and yield legislation that will go into effect this year.
Oh, I'd love to hear more about what you guys talked about, Lulu. That sounds like a great conversation. It'll be really interesting to watch as the law, is initiated, and then how bikes and cars interact with one another. We're definitely at Bike Utah hoping to do some education campaigns to help people get ready for it when it's implemented. Jace Burbage from Bike Utah says, we talked about funding projects, long timelines, and ways to galvanize support and get things done. Yeah, it's like it, and that's what's kind of cool is it's not it's not a one size fits all. There's not like one way to do bicycle advocacy. Like if you've taught me anything, Chris, it's that like it takes all different types of folks and like getting as many people to the table as you can to make things happen.
One thing we talked about was this idea that, okay, say certain actors don't want to communicate with you. Potentially there might be room for more direct actions, I guess, or like protesting, but you need to ask yourself the question, is that the type of organization you want to be? Because if that's the type of organization you want to be, maybe you're not the one who comes to the table, and you have to sort of be okay with that and be aware of that. Like, for example, us as Bike Utah, we're not going to be that organization, right? We want to be the people who are at the table and having the conversations, creating the relationships.
Yeah, that's a good point. We had that conversation too, and I hope he doesn't mind this, but Dave Iltis was in our group, and as the editor and owner of Cycling Utah, he said he's able to write editorials and maybe say things that are a little like more direct and harsher than other advocacy groups can in order to like push for change in that way. And I think it does take all different types of advocates and whatever voice and capabilities you have, lending it to like get this overall, again, like we're working towards a cultural shift. We're working towards prioritizing bikes and active transportation in our overall transportation plan. And it takes everybody communicating that they want that in some way in order for it to happen. Kaylee from Group F said that inclusion of people from all backgrounds is key to moving forward. This past year in particular brought this point to the forefront of the work. There's a lot of opportunity for growth and infrastructure work ahead. And this came up a little bit in the panel discussion earlier. Chris, I would love for you to talk a little bit about what you do at Bike Utah, what you've been working on in order to get people from different backgrounds involved with the focus groups, because that's cool.
Yeah, so I guess an initiative I've been working on is doing more targeted engagement. So oftentimes what we do is we'll do surveys and anybody can answer it. And so the problem with that we found is you often get people self-selecting in. So I did one recently where it was all white folks, and they were mostly like middle class people, and a lot of males, which is sort of problematic for getting different perspectives. So we actually held some focus groups where we had more female majority in those focus groups, and the whole sort of perspective kind of changed. It was really interesting because people started talking about their children a lot more and making streets safer for their children. And some of the men in those focus groups were like focusing on cycling more as a hobby for themselves as opposed to like a family type activity. And in some ways that makes sense, like in our culture, that it would be that way. Like if you're working all day, because we have kind of a culture where a lot of the men work and their wives stay home with the children, and that can exacerbate advocacy if those are the only voices that are coming to these meetings. And so going out of your way to make sure those other voices can speak and represent their point of view, I think is huge.
Yeah, because I mean, as a working mom, I have a totally different perspective. And as a working mom who also likes to cycle for fun, I have a different perspective. And so like being able to bring many different types of voices from different backgrounds is key in order to make sure that what is getting done, what is getting planned, isn't just for one group of people. I think we've seen that, through the past in advocacy, that a lot of the infrastructure that we're kind of stuck with today is focused more maybe on that recreation side and less on like the commuter transportation side here in Utah. And I think now, we're kind of working to shift that, or at least I know like Utah working to kind of shift that. So yes, we still have the awesome recreation facilities that we all love and make Utah, but we're also working towards making sure that there's infrastructure for the commuters and the people that rely on bikes to get around, and hopefully encouraging more people to rely on bikes to get around for better air quality and environment. Wow, we have a lot of comments from people who have been discussing. Do you see one, Chris, that you want to bring up?
Yeah, Carly, she was in my group, and she touches on this idea of like balance between pressure and positivity. And Carly talked about how she represents a sort of on the side of like environmental advocacy. She represents a group that is more gentle in their approach and more focused on creating relationships, but she has relationships with other organizations that are maybe a bit more aggressive, and they coordinate with each other and they feed information back and forth to each other because they recognize the role that each one of them is playing in this ecosystem we're talking about, and recognizing that maybe you can't be everything, but you can find the other people that sort of fit a niche maybe that you need in your community.
For sure. That's a really awesome perspective, and it's a really good thing to keep in mind. Alexa led Group A, and they discussed providing information about local facilities to the community and hosting infrastructure rides to gain community buy-in and a public opinion, and to draw a connection between people riding bikes and advocates and the city officials using real data from counters to support proposals, and for having conversations about how motor vehicles and safety play into infrastructure policy. Wow, I mean, it seems like everyone was like us. We covered a number of topics. Those are some really great conversations, and a lot of them tie into the panelist conversations as well, and earlier conversations that you hosted earlier in the summit, using real data from counters to support proposals. And I'm a huge proponent of this, and I'm really excited for things to get safer in the coming months and years, for us to do more group rides, because I believe so strongly that if you can get someone out there experiencing riding with you and like going through not like terrifying them to the point that they're too scared to go out there, but like showing them how uncomfortable it is to ride in certain situations and ride on certain facilities too, so they can know and say like, hey, let's plan a little differently in the future to make it so it is easier for people to ride.
And I think one of the points you hit on was this idea of having counter data. And I think a lot of us as advocates, we have imposter syndrome. Like we think we don't know what we're talking about. But I think we need to recognize, especially when we're talking about data, that it really doesn't exist that prominently at least in Utah. Like we don't have that many counters out. So if you can find a way to like maybe get a bunch of people to do some counts and figure out the right way to do that, and then you can bring that data, that would be huge. And then you're speaking in the same language as these city employees, and you can point to hard numbers instead of kind of just feelings or just licking your finger and putting it to the wind.
Yeah, it's going to be, I mean, we had an awesome conversation. I love the counter discussion, but we've got to go. We have some awesome, great conversations coming up in the next advocacy workshop session. Stay tuned. Chucky and Shelby are going to take it away in a minute to talk about the silent auction.